The forbidden true history of the Knights Templar. In the year 1199, 20 years after Christian armies captured Jerusalem from the Fatimid Caliphate in a siege so brutal that blood reportedly ran through the streets, the road between the port of Jaffa and the Holy City had become a killing ground. Pilgrims were being massacred by the hundreds. They traveled from the coast of modern-day Israel through territory nominally under Christian control, carrying the savings of their entire lives, and found that control of a city wall meant nothing about the safety of the roads between it and the next village. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had an army capable of defending its cities. It had almost nothing capable of protecting the tens of thousands of European Christians who made the journey every year. In 1119, a French knight from the Champagne region named Hugues de Payens approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a proposal that had no precedent in the medieval world. He and 8 companions wanted to form a religious brotherhood, specifically devoted to protecting these pilgrims, not as soldiers who happened to be Christian, but as monks who happened to be soldiers. They would take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They would live communally. They would pray the canonical hours. And they would fight. King Baldwin agreed and granted the small brotherhood quarters in a wing of his own palace, built on the site the Crusaders believed to be the ancient Temple of Solomon. From that location, they took their name. The 9 founding members remained a modest and barely known institution for nearly a decade. They were too poor, according to one contemporary account, to field more than a single horse between 2 of them, which is why the iconic image of 2 knights sharing a horse appeared on the Templar seal and has been associated with them for 9 centuries since. Here are the questions that make their story so extraordinary. How did 9 monks with shared horses become the most powerful military and financial institution in the medieval world? How did men sworn to poverty come to hold wealth that made kings beg them for loans? And how did an institution founded to protect the innocent end up destroyed by a king who feared what he owed them? A pope gives warriors powers no king could touch. In January of 1129, the most powerful religious voice in 12th century Europe convened a council in the city of Troyes in northern France. His name was Bernard of Clairvaux, and he was not a pope or a king. He was a Cistercian abbot who had made himself, through the sheer force of his writing and preaching, the moral conscience of Western Christendom. The council he organized formally examined the fledgling Order of Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. What emerged would transform a group of 9 obscure monks into a supranational institution answerable to no one on earth except the Bishop of Rome. Bernard himself drafted the Latin rule that the council adopted for the new order. Its 72 clauses combined the Benedictine monastic tradition with a specific military purpose that Bernard defended in a remarkable theological tract titled De Laude Novae Militiae, in praise of the new knighthood. Bernard argued that killing in defense of the faith was not the sin of murder, but what he called malicidium, the elimination of evil. The warrior monk was not a contradiction. He was, Bernard insisted, a new kind of man entirely. By 1130, donations of castles, land, gold, and silver were arriving from noble families across France, England, Portugal, Spain, Germany, and the Italian peninsula. The floodgates had opened. The decisive moment came on March 29, 1139, when Pope Innocent II issued the papal bull Omne Datum Optimum, every perfect gift. In a single document, the Templars were placed directly under papal protection, freed from the authority of every local bishop and every secular ruler on the continent. They were exempted from paying tithes. They could collect donations, build their own churches, and bury their own dead in their own cemeteries. They could keep the spoils of war. And they answered, in all matters, only to the Pope. In a medieval world where the local bishop could excommunicate a lord and where kings derived their authority from the church, this exemption was not a privilege. It was a superpower. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support, and let's continue. Warrior monks build Europe's first international banking system. Sometime around the year 1150, a Templar administrator in France or England solved a problem that had been costing pilgrims their savings and their lives for decades. How to travel with wealth across a continent full of bandits and border crossings without carrying it physically. The solution was elegant and completely without precedent in Western Europe. A pilgrim could walk into a Templar preceptory, one of the fortified houses the order maintained across the continent, and deposit his gold, silver, or valuables. He would receive in return a document, encoded in a cipher, known only to the order's administrators, describing what he had deposited. When he arrived in Jerusalem, he could present that document at another Templar facility and withdraw an equivalent amount. The document itself was worthless to a thief who intercepted it. Only the Templar network could read it, verify it, and honor it. Financial historians now recognize this as the first private international banking network in Western history. The institution, Italy's Banca Monte dei Paschi di Siena, is often called the world's oldest bank. It was founded in 1472, more than 300 years after the Templars had already been operating their credit system. Financial Times columnist Tim Harford described the Temple Church in London as the Western Union of the Crusades. The system expanded steadily. By the 12th century, the Templars could transfer funds between individual accounts, moving money from one client's holdings to another's anywhere in their network. They made loans to monarchs and nobles at rates disguised as service fees rather than interest, cleverly circumventing the Church's laws against usury. The French royal treasury was housed in the Templar facility in Paris. The Templars collected the Saladin tax in England for King Richard I. They advanced 36,000 marks to King Henry II of England for military campaigns. They owned the entire Mediterranean island of Cyprus and maintained a fleet of ships. At their peak, they operated close to 1,000 preceptories across Europe and the Crusader states. The very wealth that made them indispensable would eventually make them a target. 1,600 knights defeat Saladin against all odds. On November the 25th, 1177, one of the most improbable military victories in the history of the Crusades took place in the low hills near the town of Ramla, in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a battle called Montgisar, and it should not have been possible. Saladin had recently consolidated the Sunni Muslim world's two greatest power centers, uniting the caliphates of Cairo and Damascus into a single Ayyubid Sultanate. His army numbered approximately 26,000 soldiers. The man who had to stop him was Baldwin IV, King of Jerusalem, 16 years old, already gravely ill with leprosy, described by medieval chroniclers as having lost sensation in his hands and unable to control them. He left Jerusalem with approximately 375 knights and 80 Templars. Saladin, satisfied that this force posed no threat, allowed his army to spread across the countryside to plunder and forage. The Grand Master of the Templars, Odo de Saint-Amand, had been blockaded with his knights at Gaza. The young king had been pinned at Ascalon. Both broke their respective blockades and converged on Saladin's dispersed army at Montgisar. The Crusader cavalry caught the Muslim forces entirely unprepared for a pitched battle. Saladin's personal bodyguard attempted to hold but was overwhelmed. The rout was total. Saladin fled on a racing camel. His chronicler recorded that he reached Cairo with approximately 1/10 of the army he had left with. Crusader losses, according to contemporary sources, were approximately 1,100 killed and 750 wounded, meaning the survivors had inflicted devastating casualties on an army many times their size. Muslim historians of the period recorded that Saladin considered the humiliation of Montgisar so severe that it was only redeemed by his victory 10 years later at Hattin. The Templars had bought the Kingdom of Jerusalem a decade. One disastrous general delivers Jerusalem back to Islam. By the year 1187, nearly everything that the Battle of Montgisar had preserved was undone in a single afternoon. The man most historians blame for the catastrophe was not Saladin. It was Gerard de Riedfort, the Grand Master of the Knights Templar. In May of 1187, de Riedfort led an attack at the Spring of Cresson against a Muslim force he was explicitly warned not to engage. His force numbered 150 knights and 300 soldiers. The result was a massacre. Virtually the entire Templar contingent was annihilated before Saladin had even launched his main campaign. The kingdom had lost its most experienced fighting men before the decisive battle was fought. In early July, Saladin assembled his largest army, approximately 40,000 soldiers, and besieged Tiberias, trapping the wife of the Count of Tripoli inside its citadel. Raymond of Tripoli, the most experienced military mind in the kingdom, advised the Christian army not to march across open, waterless country to relieve the city. Saladin, he argued, could not sustain a siege indefinitely in that heat. De Riedfort argued the opposite, pressuring King Guy de Lusignan to advance. On July 2nd, the Christian army of more than 20,000 men left the relative safety of their encampment at Sephoria. Saladin cut off their access to the Sea of Galilee. His forces lit the dry grass around the Christian army. On the afternoon of July 4th, surrounded by fire and dying of thirst on the twin peaks called the Horns of Hattin, the Crusader army collapsed. Saladin captured King Guy and most of the Christian lords. He personally executed Reynald of Chatillon. He ordered the beheading of nearly all captured Templars and Hospitallers, offering soldiers a small bounty for each head. Only de Riedfort, the Grand Master whose decisions had helped cause the disaster, was spared. Jerusalem fell to Saladin in October of 1187, 3 months after Hattin. The Holy Land falls, and the order loses purpose. In the spring of 1291, the Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil assembled the largest army the Muslim world had yet deployed against the remaining Crusader territories. A force estimated at over 100,000 soldiers equipped with some of the most advanced siege machinery of the medieval period. His target was the city of Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold on the coast of the Holy Land and the effective capital of what remained of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Templars fought in Acre to the end. Their Grand Master Guillaume de Beaujeu was killed during the defense on May 18th. The surviving knights held out in their fortified compound after the rest of the city fell, eventually pulling the walls down on themselves and the attacking Mamluks rather than surrender. By the time the smoke cleared, the last Templar presence on the Palestinian coast was gone. The order retreated to Cyprus, still enormously wealthy, still organized, still capable of fielding a military force, but without a battlefield that justified any of it. In 1300, they attempted a combined operation with the Hospitallers and Cypriot forces to retake the coastal town of Tortosa. It failed. In 1302, they lost the island of Ruad off the Syrian coast, their last foothold in the Levant. The Mamluks had broken the terms of surrender and massacred or enslaved the garrison. Jacques de Molay became Grand Master around 1292. He spent the next decade and a half traveling across Europe, meeting with kings and popes, presenting plans for a new crusade that required armies of 15,000 knights, 50,000 infantry, and a major fleet. Edward I of England was fighting the Scots. Philip IV of France was fighting the English and drowning in debt. The plans produced words and promises and nothing else. An order built for war had no war left to fight, but it still controlled wealth that made the most powerful monarch in Europe lie awake at night calculating what he owed. A king drowning in debt plots the perfect betrayal. By 1303, Philip IV of France, known to history as Philip the Fair, had already demonstrated his willingness to destroy financial institutions that held power over him. In 1291, he had expelled the Lombard bankers and seized their assets. In 1306, he had expelled the Jewish population of France and confiscated everything they owned. He had once been forced to take refuge inside the Paris Temple, the Templar fortress in the heart of the French capital, when a mob attacked him over his currency debasement. The Templars had defended him. He had also borrowed from them extensively to finance his wars against England and Flanders, and the debt had grown to proportions he could never realistically repay through legitimate means. The mechanism was supplied by a disgruntled former Templar who had been expelled from the order for misconduct and brought accusations of heresy and depravity to the French crown. Philip's chancellor, Guillaume de Nogaret, recognized the opportunity and began assembling a dossier. Philip's intelligence agents circulated rumors about the order throughout France. A compliant pope, Clement V, a Frenchman whom Philip had essentially engineered into the papacy and relocated to Avignon, within Philip's reach, was brought into the plan. On September 14th, 1307, sealed orders went out to every royal officer across the Kingdom of France with instructions not to open them until the night of October 12th. The orders described an operation of remarkable coordination: the simultaneous arrest of every Templar in France, from the Grand Master down to the youngest novice, at precisely the same moment at dawn. The charges were ready. The torturers were prepared. The entire apparatus of medieval justice had been placed in the service of a king who wanted to escape his creditors. And on the morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, it all began. Friday the 13th changes everything in medieval Europe. At dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, soldiers acting on the sealed orders of King Philip IV of France arrested every member of the Knights Templar they could find in the kingdom simultaneously. The operation had been planned in total secrecy for weeks. It caught the Templars entirely by surprise. Jacques de Molay, the 73-year-old Grand Master, was seized in Paris. He had been there for months attending to business with the papal curia, completely unaware of what was being prepared around him. Approximately 15,000 Templar members were targeted. Most were captured. The charges were spectacular and designed to produce maximum shock across Christendom. The Templars stood accused of spitting or urinating on the cross during secret initiation ceremonies, of denying Christ 3 times, of worshiping a bearded demonic idol called Baphomet, of engaging in obscene kissing rituals, of condoning homosexual relations among members. The accusations had been assembled from the testimony of expelled former members with personal grievances, and they were precisely calibrated to disgust, scandalize, and overwhelm any possibility of a rational defense. Torture produced the confessions Philip needed. Methods applied to Templar prisoners in France included the strappado, having hands bound behind the back and being suspended by the wrists until the joints dislocated, the rack, the roasting of the soles of the feet with hot irons, then covering the burns with vinegar to intensify the pain, prolonged starvation. In Paris alone, over 100 Templars were subjected to these methods within the first 2 weeks. Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master himself, eventually confessed, though the specific charge he admitted to was spitting near a cross, not directly on it. He urged other Templars to confess as well. Outside France, the picture was dramatically different. In England, Germany, Cyprus, Castile, Portugal, and Aragon, investigations conducted without torture produced almost no confessions and no evidence of genuine heresy. The Templars in those countries were largely found innocent. The confessions were a French product. In May of 1310, 54 Templars who had retracted their forced confessions were burned alive in a field outside Paris. The smoke visible from the city convinced those still imprisoned that retraction meant incineration. Philip had his confessions. The last Grand Master burns and curses his killers. On March 18th, 1314, 7 years after his arrest and imprisonment, the 70-year-old Jacques de Molay was led from his cell in Paris to a scaffold erected before the façade of Notre Dame Cathedral. The plan was a final public ceremony. De Molay and 3 other senior Templar leaders would appear before the crowd, read prepared statements of guilt, accept the mercy of the Church in the form of life imprisonment, and end the matter. It was supposed to be theater, controlled, scripted, and final. De Molay and the preceptor of Normandy, Geoffroy de Charnay, did not follow the script. Both publicly recanted their confessions. Both proclaimed the innocence of the order and declared that whatever statements had been extracted from them under torture bore no relationship to the truth. De Molay's voice, according to eyewitnesses, was clear and without trembling. Philip IV did not hesitate. He ordered both men seized and burned at the stake that same evening, without further trial or hearing. Cardinal legates, who had been present at the sentencing, complied. De Molay and de Charnay were taken to the Ile de Javieux, a small sandbank in the Seine River, directly in front of the royal gardens, where the pyres had been constructed. Historical accounts indicate the fires were built to burn slowly, by deliberate instruction. De Molay reportedly faced his execution without visible fear. From the flames, according to multiple eyewitness accounts and contemporary chronicles, including a poem by Geoffrey of Paris, de Molay called out an invocation to God to judge those responsible for his death. He summoned Philip IV and Pope Clement V to answer before divine justice within the year. Pope Clement V died on April the 20th, 1314, 33 days later, of a long intestinal illness. King Philip IV of France died on November 29th, 1314, 8 months after de Molay, of a stroke suffered during a hunting accident. He was 46 years old. A dying order's legacy reshapes the modern world. The Knights Templar officially ceased to exist in 1312. What followed over the next decades was a succession of coincidences so extraordinary that they embedded the order permanently in the mythology of Western civilization. Philip IV's 3 sons, Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV, each became king of France, and each died without surviving male heirs. Between 1314 and 1328, the 300-year-old House of Capet, the oldest royal dynasty in France, ceased to exist in its direct line. The succession crisis produced a disputed claim to the French throne by Edward III of England through his mother, a daughter of Philip IV, and that claim triggered the 100 Years' War, the conflict that defined French and English national identity for the following century. Whether Jacques de Molay's dying words constituted a genuine curse, a coincidence, or a literary legend assembled from multiple sources after the fact, medieval chroniclers noted the deaths and connected them to the execution. The story spread across Europe within a generation and has never stopped circulating. Maurice Drouin's series of historical novels, Les Rois Maudits, The Accursed Kings, published between 1955 and 1977, told the story of the Templars and the Capetian collapse. Drouin himself has stated that the series was one of the primary inspirations for George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, and the television adaptation Game of Thrones. In September of 2001, Italian paleographer Barbara Frail discovered in the Vatican's secret archives a document known as the Chinon Parchment. Dating from 1308, it confirmed that Pope Clement V had privately absolved Jacques de Molay and the other Templar leaders of heresy 1 year after their arrest, and then suppressed the finding under political pressure from Philip. In 2011, Pope Benedict XVI formally acknowledged that the persecution of the Knights Templar had been unjust. The Order of Christ in Portugal, the direct institutional successor to the Templars, financed the Portuguese voyages of exploration that opened the sea route to India. The white sails of Vasco da Gama's fleet bore the red cross of the Templars. Temple Church in London, consecrated in 1185, still stands in the heart of the city's legal district. The superstition of Friday the 13th, whatever its actual origins, remains inseparably associated in popular culture with the morning Philip's soldiers came for the monks.